Okay, well, thank you to everyone for being here. I think we're all very excited to start sharing a little bit of the work that we've been undertaking this past period. This is a space for sharing some initial findings that our team, so Sarah and I, I'm Eka. Sarah and I work with the African Leadership Center and have really been involved in reflecting on the socio-economic impact of mine clearance. So these are some, outcomes that are just coming out. I think it's great that we follow Paul because there we saw this shift into a more integrated sort of analysis around conversations on mine clearance. And so we're going to continue that pattern because here we're thinking of mine clearance as a part of peace-building discourse, right? Both in theory but also in practice. So what we're looking to do here is we reflect briefly on the narratives on peace building and mine clearance. Think also about the interactions across clearance and socioeconomic factors. And we'll be drawing there on our case studies, Somaliland and Cambodia. I think earlier on, Panos had reflected on the fact that this project is very much a joint work amongst the partners. But on that, our choice of case studies have come out of engagement with the Halo Trust, who shared with us what their own priorities were. And so keeping in the spirit with the way we're going to generate impact from this, it was important certainly to be carrying out, to be looking at spaces and contexts that would help with generating that impact. Part of the journey here in terms of this research is that the work we do on within the social science element of the project should help support the prioritization of the implementation of the technology that Jamie was speaking about earlier. And we thought a way to guide us into that conversation is actually to look at how prioritization is being done, has been done over time, and how that's being done presently. It's a very complicated space, but what we've come across so far, I hope we can reflect on that a bit. And then we'll wrap up. Okay. So just to begin on the narratives on peace building and mine clearance, what we are doing, so we use this tool, the Humanitarian Mine Action Peace Building Palette. And that has these four main components. The idea here is that mine clearance, or mine action as a whole, even though we focus on mine clearance, we are aware that talking about clearance has to be part of a mine action agenda, which would involve risk education, for instance. So that sits within the security element of this. But the notion is there's a recognition that to deal with or to have conversations about peace building, it has to be about how mine clearance speaks to other elements in the peace building process. Right? So this is why we've come across this. And we do that in spite of the fact that there are, it's not a smooth space. There are challenges around thinking of how one can reflect on peace building and mine clearance. And this is especially as you go along the conflict cycle to a space where clearance is not simply about humanitarian priorities, but also about developmental priorities. So there you see, for instance, the sort of short-term focus or agenda in the humanitarian period and how that can be at odds with a more developmental long-term focus as well. Having said that, this is a critical deployment of this palette. So we think it's useful, but we recognize that there are some limitations. For instance, mine clearance remains confined to the security element of this palette, in spite of the fact that, as I hope you will see as you come with me on this journey, that actually mine clearance speaks to a range of other issues. It speaks to socioeconomic foundations, which is what we'll focus on here today, but it also speaks to reconciliation and justice, and we'll reflect on this briefly in the Somaliland case. So as I say, we still use it because, it still allows us to think of clearance in this integrated way. We use it also in a way that is about, so it's deductive in that we start from there, but we use it as an entry point. It's a framework we think allows us to sort of pick what sectors we can begin the investigation with. So in doing so, we draw on the Socio-Economic Foundation. So I think there are about 5 elements within that. We focus on 3. We focus on these 3 on physical reconstruction, economic reconstruction, infrastructure and health, health and education. And we do that because this allows us to reflect on a longer timeline. Because another element of what this project is trying to do is to look at the impact, socioeconomic impact, over a longer period of time. Generally, the impact assessments that you find in the literature focus on a very short space of time. And this often has to do with the cost-benefit analysis that are put in place. And it comes down to a conversation about whether it's worth clearing or not. But that judgment is made in a very short period. Also bearing in mind, when you focus on a short period like that, if we bear in mind the integrated approach, you are not taking into account the sort of environmental conditions that would allow one to see greater benefits from mine clearance. I know that we use a working group methodology, so we use this as an entry point, but we certainly rely on local realities as guiding us along our journey. So we went in, so in both cases, that's what we did. We looked at secondary literature, had a sense of, the dynamics, what was speaking to us, but we went into our case studies with our research questions, with our propositions, to say, this is what we're getting. This is what we're getting from the literature. These are the lines of inquiry we want to pursue. What do you think about this? So we did this in roundtable discussions with a select group of participants to provide guidance to us, to tell us, no, you're barking up the wrong tree there, or this is a good direction, or deepen this, or deepen that. And that's what we've done in both cases. So on physical infrastructure, we focus on airports, ports, temples. All of that is informed by the context we're looking at. And in terms of economic reconstruction, we focus on agriculture, and for Cambodia and in Somaliland on livestock. And that, again, is because of the roles that these sectors play within those contexts. We are still looking at I think there's a general assumption to be made about the impact clearance can have on health and education infrastructure, but we're still reviewing that evidence, so I will not be speaking to that today. Okay. So as we proceed, now I've reflected on what mine clearance, peace building, that interaction from the framework we're using, but I thought it was important also, we thought it was important also, to think about what that means within the context that we're looking at, right? So we see in Somaliland, even though it's logical that mine clearance would be part of peace building, and in Somaliland we see that. We see how clearance initially was conceptualized as part of peace building in the humanitarian phase, so the immediate aftermath of conflict. And we see it come up because it was seen as a form of reconciliation. So even conversations about where to begin, issues like that, brought about different groups to sit and take decisions or make suggestions about what ought to happen. And in that way, one could see this as playing a peace-building role, or at least it fed into a narrative in that way. But we go on later into the conflict cycle. This linkage between clearance and peace building sort of peters off. We don't see it as being so prominent anymore. What we do see, though, is that peace building is seen as very closely related with economic recovery. Yeah? And at the same time, clearance is also seen as related to economic development or recovery as well. But that conversation about clearance and peace building sort of breaks off. In the case of Cambodia, we see that actually clearance has never been formally conceptualized as peace building, right? But there's recognition that clearance is important to economic development and reconstruction. And I think these factors speak to the way that clearance is often linked to early stages in the conflict cycle. There's a focus on the humanitarian period and a sort of disjuncture between that humanitarian element and development as something that comes after the passage of time. And we take an embedded case study approach, so we look at these countries, but we try to focus our attention where possible on particular areas to sort of go into depth and observe things at a more micro level. So that's what we've done here. So in the case, it's a sort of triangulation of sorts. Certainly in some aspects, you're taking a national picture, but where we have to go into greater depth, we try to focus on these cases. We've selected these cases also based on the extent of mine contamination and clearance as well, but also the extent to which they speak to the economic priorities that we highlighted before. So now we'll go into the Somaliland case and just speak about some of the interactions across clearance and socioeconomic factors. So as I said, we start off with livestock and livestock trade. Why do we do that? Because it plays a very prominent role in the Somaliland economy. We see how it generates about 70% of employment, 60% of GDP, and 85% of export earnings. And it's very important, the conversation about export earnings, because as a net importer of foods, Somaliland needs to generate that foreign exchange to be able to import food. So that's important for food security. Livestock, we see, and we can see the prominence of livestock even within the state agenda as well. We see how it has the largest commitment for capital expenditure for the economy within the National Development Plan. So that also speaks to its prioritization within the state itself. Another point to bear in mind, as we've had, I think in parts, this conversation about distinguishing between APMs and AVMs, is the fact that livestock actually are at risk from both APMs and AVMs. And AVMs for the larger animals, camels and donkeys, which is not something we'd expected, but in research it came across that that was the case. And this is quite critical because these animals are especially beasts of burden, so play quite a prominent role within this context. So we look at the more macro level, it becomes quite apparent that actually clearance has had a very useful impact. For one, the lower levels of loss of life and amputations as well. And this is quite important in terms of the value of livestock, which, as I said, the Somaliland economy depends extensively on livestock trade, but also their utility as beasts of burden, their utility within rural communities. Something else that we came across is the fact that actually you have improved access to veterinary services, and this is quite important. Again, we see this prioritized within the National Development Plan, and this has come about because vets simply have better access to a range of animals across Somaliland, and evidence of that is how you had very sparse incidents of vaccinations over 1990 to 2001, and the conversations reveal that actually since 2011 there have been more regular vaccination programs, and this has also been linked to the greater access that the vets actually have to these spaces. There's some evidence there of sort of the averages in terms of vaccinations that are delivered, and also the growth in the vaccination teams and the sort of coverage they're potentially able to achieve. Now, of course, vaccinations are very, very vital, very important for health and productivity, especially around contagious and destructive diseases, and the risk that this, therefore, can present to the livestock economy. Also, what we see is because of clearance, there's better access to grazing land, and this is very critical, very important to the livestock economy. And also, in an age with a lot of consciousness around the challenges, the environmental challenges of grazing as well, this is quite critical because there you see also a possibility of managing grazing to avoid overgrazing, to also be able to deal with seasonal changes. Yeah, and so it supports, in a sense, or potentially supports adaptability to some of these changes. So that's all well and good. This is also a priority for the state, and you see this feature prominently in the National Development Plan. Having said that, as I said, we take a critical approach, and I think it's important to reflect on the fact that while that is great, there's some other issues that emerge around the fact that animals now have more space for grazing. One of those that was apparent is actually the conservation challenges that have emerged out of this, because the animals are now able to move more widely, and there's a major problem with a particular invasive weed called garanwa. And it came about that actually now you have a wider incidence of this contamination because the animals are able to move around more so than they were in the past. In some cases, you also see where land has been cleared, but you've had a change in vegetation. And that means that land can no longer be grazed. You have bush encroachment, for instance. And so you open up the land, but the benefits you were hoping for are no longer possible. A final point on this that's very critical was a conversation we had. I mean, social scientists will focus a lot on the socio-economic, but I think it was very important to highlight the socio-cultural elements to some of this. And upon some reflections, conversations, it came about that there is a reality of a distrust of the land, the sort of trust that people, generations have had in the land as a source of sustenance, as shelter, and how there's a breakdown in all of that because of mine contamination. And that this can be quite difficult to shift even where you've had clearance, right? And I think this speaks also, I mean, we might target perception, but I think it speaks to something deeper, but linked to that perception conversation that we've been having over time. Yeah. So this sense that once they're mines, they're always mines. It's changed the very construct and your engagement with your environment. And I think it's important to mention those because it's great that we celebrate that mines have been cleared, but we need to also understand the realities when we reflect on the impact that that clearance is actually able to have. So these don't fall strictly in the areas of our focus, but I thought they were still very much worth highlighting. There are conversations also about increased opportunities for tourism where this might not have been the case. On the one hand is the direct impact of clearance, which means people can go to spaces they couldn't go to in the past, but also a greater sense of safety. That can be linked to mine clearance, but also linked to progress beyond the immediate aftermath of conflict in and of itself. So there are reflections and conversations about visiting Lasgil and being able to see some rather impressive sites. But what was raised also was the challenge around the visibility, the markers of mine clearance. And how, yes, that space has been cleared, but that introduces an element of fear that would otherwise not have been there, right? And this draws us back to the perception issue. And I believe this is something that we picked up on in our conversations about Cambodia as well, and conversations that are going on there about clearing temples. And how, while it is important to clear the temples, there's a risk that when there's visibility that this activity is going on, it can put off potential tourists because there's a concern. There's the knowledge that there were mines here can in itself present a challenge in spite of the fact that those mines have actually been cleared. Something that's coming up very increasingly topical is actually the potential significance of resource extraction in Somaliland. And there, I believe in our conversations, Halo Trust have been consulted on this, looking into the Sahel region. So there we see, I mean, it's somewhat speculative. We can reflect on what the potential impact of clearance in that context might well be. So let me move now to physical reconstruction, a topic we've been speaking about quite intensively through the course of the day, have been roads. And this is, of course, because if we're talking about AVMs, this is where we see these most, not exclusively, but especially prominently. Also in this context, we see roads as being quite significant, a major priority for Somaliland itself. And we see this as having the top spend in terms of infrastructural development commitments within the National Development Plan. What we also find is where you've had mine contamination, and it's interesting the conversation about perceptions, both actual and suspected contamination tends to have a similar impact in terms of how people moderate their behavior to cope with those changes. So we've seen this reflections on how routes of travel from Hargeisa to Berbera, people take other routes because of a perception that there's mine contamination on that road and take a much longer route through Hargeisa to Borao before they get to Berbera, and the sort of transaction costs that are accompany that. We've also reflected in conversations with the Road Development Agency on how the rebuilding of roads has also been affected by a realization that there's mine contamination and the sort of additional costs that come to bear in a situation like that, where, of course, in this space, being able to already commit to that sort of infrastructural development is quite a burden. But having said all that, we see where actually, due to the presence and activity of mine clearance, you see the rehabilitation of quite significant roads. The Erigabo-Burao Road is one such road. But as part of that process, you also saw an increase in the costs of rehabilitating that road that was due to either actual contamination or suspected contamination. So having said that, again, mine clearance is very important, but it's important to bear in mind there are other factors that come to play when you speak about road rehabilitation. From our experiences, what we observed, for instance, is how clan groups actually have quite an important role to play in how roads are built, in road networks, in a sense of ownership of particular roads. That can actually mean you have roads that are traversing very similar routes, because having roads, having access is something quite important within that social space, right? So it's not simple, it's that clearance is significant, but there are other factors that inform this sort of rehabilitation. Also, a key point, something that we came across that's really very interesting, is the significance of diaspora resources that goes into also the rebuilding of these roads. So just highlighting that this clearance occurs alongside a range of other factors that are very contextually determined as well. So in terms of physical reconstruction, strategic infrastructure is another space that was quite significant in Somaliland. So the Hargeisa Airport, for instance, very important. You see civil aviation play quite a significant role in terms of the priorities of the government. We see also how the expansion of the airport in 2012 was dependent on mine clearance activities. It's quite critical. You think also of impact, so beyond actually the rehabilitation of the airport, what that has meant, and I make the last point, what that has meant also in political economy terms, because Somaliland itself, fighting for international recognition, it's very important that it comes across as accessible as a space, and also the political statements that are made where particular airlines decide to be able to fly into Hargeisa is quite critical. So it has a very important role beyond the obvious economic relevance. But what is also observed is that land use and value has also increased around the areas that have been cleared in Hargeisa. This increase in value has also been linked to increased demand from diaspora spaces, so funds coming in, and that pushes on that. That pushes up value, but also has come with some challenges in terms of contestations around access to land and purchase of land. Very important, critical area of debate is the Berber Report. Now, from our conversation, I mean, the Berber Report is very significant, as I mentioned, livestock trade, very important to Somaliland economy, and so almost all exports go out through the Berber Report. So this has been very important for Somaliland, but also for Ethiopia and for Puntland, Ethiopia being landlocked. And so the port is very important to sort of the Somaliland economy as a whole, but also very important in political economy terms. The extent to which Somaliland is able to play a more strategic role within the continent, and now in terms of relationships between Africa and the Middle East, is greatly heightened by its capacity to utilize the Berber Port to that end as well. Yeah. So what we have observed, and we've been looking into in terms of the port itself, mine clearance is linked to that, but what we've observed is certainly it's been problematic for some of the trade routes to the port. And we've seen how some roads have been rehabilitated and how that actually has informed, in a sense, the dynamism of the port as a major source of income, as an important part of the Somaliland economic agenda. We also see how a road that's very important for servicing the port has been rehabilitated, and that's on the borders that had been heavily contaminated. So there's a sense in which some reflection on how mine clearance has informed the rehabilitation of those two roads. Yes, and I make the point already on how this is important for its recognition agenda. We'll move now to reflect on Cambodia. And as I mentioned, we're going to look at economic reconstruction, focusing on agriculture. And here again, we focus on this because it's a very critical part of the economy in Cambodia, and also in terms of livelihoods as a whole. We see how rice is a dominant cultivated crop. Very important if you think that rice alone as an agricultural product generates 29% of the country's GDP. Now what we see in terms of what has occurred after clearance within the spaces that we looked at is how there's a shift from subsistence farming to larger scale agriculture, also shifting to cash crop cultivation. We noticed also a shift from rice cultivation, not in general, but in some aspects, rice to cassava, which requires higher levels of mechanization. And I think this speaks very much to the AVM conversation. Also observe a greater variety of crops in the market. This speaks to this wider diversity in terms of cultivation. So while a lot of this, I mean, there are clear links between this and the incidence of mine clearance, there are other factors, again, to bear in mind as guiding what we see. One of those is changing agricultural practices that are due to adaptability and to resilience, right? The fact that cassava requires less water for cultivation, for instance, and also lower labor requirements has also informed this shift. Another fact to bear in mind is the fact that cleared land is not always immediately put to use because of a range of factors. Sometimes poor access to water, for instance, has come up as a challenge, but also the fact that those that will be cultivating the land are actually necessarily engaged in migrant work over in Thailand. Another point we found here is also where cleared land is then purchased by larger landowners. And this is a major problem. So the land is cleared for a particular purpose, but because of the conditions within the market for land, they actually go on to others. So to respond to that, there is a policy in place that is supposed to ensure that cleared land is not sold before a 5-year period. It's not sold on for at least a 5-year period. In terms of physical reconstruction, we looked and observed the work that's been going on around temples, reflecting on how temples are cleared. You know, in some regard, as social spaces, we know that some funders have prioritized temples as cultural, social spaces. But also, there's a big point that locally, focus here was also because they were very well-populated areas, and this was a priority then. And that was what drove this. But actually, what has come about as a result of that has been the major growth of tourism as a result of the opening up of those spaces. I think also, of course, a general, more general sense of safety and security has a big role to play there. But I think certainly we can reflect on how mine clearance has informed that as well. And we see what happened in terms of numbers and in terms of resources from the tourism sector. Something that was very interesting to note was the fact that actually some of the revenue that comes from tourism of the temples is channeled back directly to support clearance activities in Cambodia. So we also see how these clearance and economic benefits actually are fueling one another. So moving to prioritization, I think in both cases, well, our reflections show that, of course, this is very contextual, but there are certain factors that traverse both of these cases. Casualty figures are very important for how a clearance is prioritized, community priorities, donor priorities, of course, and land ownership has come out as something that's quite important. In Somaliland, for instance, communal land tends to be prioritized in this regard. Something else that's quite significant is the way in which the clearance of border areas tends to come later. And some of this is linked to political sensitivity. So currently, this is how prioritization in Cambodia has come across to us. A look at accidents, actual survey data, and, you know, as I said, population data really links to the temples conversation, land ownership and productivity. And then, you know, also recognition of development action plans and local needs. So this shift, again, we see, recognize this shift from a purely humanitarian focus to a more developmental agenda. And what's also interesting about Cambodia is the fact that this is increasingly financed domestically, right? And we'll reflect on that very briefly in a moment. In Somaliland, over time, it's focused on, you know, population figures, so major dense population centers, so cities. Hargeisa was very much prioritized as part of this. Strategic infrastructure has also come up as important spaces to to prioritize, then agricultural lands and roads coming later on. At the moment, what you see is a situation that seems to be quite demand-led, and certainly a lot of demand in terms of reflection on the work that needs to be done on roads. Another area we can reflect on prioritization is a sort of shift from the humanitarian to developmental phase, is the roles of particular stakeholders over time. So I think in both cases we see, well, certainly, let me begin with Cambodia, heavier participation of donors, operators in setting priorities earlier on. But as time goes on, and you have a strengthening of local structures, as well as, in a sense, the prioritization of those local structures into local political economies, you see a more dynamic role for domestic actors. In Somaliland, I think over time you have this trajectory, heavier participation of operators, international agencies, donors as well. You have structures in place that have not quite followed the same trajectory in terms of how they've been strengthened. But you do have the SMAC in place, you have the local structures. You also have domestic priorities play a role, so we see actually this focus and insistence on roads also speaks to domestic priorities around the need to open up roads for trade and for communities as well. But in a sense, that strengthening of the domestic focus, you don't see that in a similar sense to what you see in Cambodia. Of course, these are very distinct, very separate spaces. So I would really hesitate to draw a comparison, a very simplistic comparison. What, though, is worth reflecting on is actually the particular political economy of Somaliland itself. And I think the way, on my reflection, the way that a lack of recognition actually challenges the structures that are set up to deal with this issue. So, for instance, the way that funds are channeled to Somaliland tends to have to go through Somalia, or they have to stay with the international actors, a far more complex process than with other contexts and other spaces. And that's something to bear in mind. And another point to bear in mind is actually the way in which sort of an openness to international actors has a range of roles in Somaliland. It also signals and indicates an openness, a readiness to engage on a global stage, and actually may then be treated as something that's quite positive in terms of driving this recognition agenda. Something else we've noticed as well is the sort of return to security, having had this humanitarian to development shift, if you think of priorities. So on the one hand, what we see is sort of increased interaction with security actors in the mine clearance space. Some of this perhaps could speak to increased trust or decreased distrust in core security actors. Of course, in the immediate post-conflict phase, this tends to be a far more sensitive issue. We see the military return to participate more centrally in Cambodia and mine clearance, so that's been an interesting observation. And asking some questions around this, is there possibly a return to prioritizing state security, international security concerns? For instance, we note how certain donors are funding clearance to avoid wider misuse of explosives beyond the particular context in question, so this sort of international security conversation. And then a point that's been raised several times already, is there a sense of a sort of decreasing priority of clearance in general? That means actually for a particular unit to retain relevance, it needs to find a space elsewhere. So we see SMAC being absorbed by the Ministry of Defense in Somaliland, for instance. So that speaks to that situation. And then, of course, as you mentioned, borders tend to come later. And perhaps with this more sensitive activities in terms of clearance of borders, there is a role for the military or for security actors to play there. So to finalize, we think of the critical deployment of the palette, so engagement with the peace-building palette, and actually what we see is that mine clearance is, of course, not confined to the security element of that. It's very relevant also to socio-economic priorities, as you see, but also to reconciliation. Clearance has been important and significant to economic recovery and physical reconstruction from the cases that we've looked at. It's been important in terms of priority setting. So in the domestic narratives around peace building, even though we see that de-link between clearance and peace building, we see that very clear link between clearance and economic development or economic reconstruction. So this is something actually that within structures priority setting, this is seen as important, but also we see this in practice if we reflect back on the empirical points that we raised. Asking questions then about why do we see mine clearance located within the security aspect of the palette? Now, some of that may be linked to the fact that all of that is constructed around a very humanitarian focus on in the way that we think about mine clearance. So we see this as really a security issue, which is the way you would see it until you go further along the conflict cycle. Yeah, I mentioned the point about humanitarian phase and reconciliation. But I think what is clear actually is that the multidimensional reach of mine clearance hopefully reflects that it has quite a significant role to play within the peace-building discourse, whether or not it is conceptualized as such, because peace-building itself involves economic reconstruction. So some points of note. So economic activities have tended to carry on in the spaces we've looked at in spite of contamination. That's something to bear in mind. And I think in both spaces, especially in border areas, you see the continuation of these activities. And in a sense, the push for clearance is really to reduce the risk that communities expose themselves to. What we also found was a challenge in terms of connecting the relevance of clearance to people's current realities. And that was really interesting. And I think also speaks to some of the problems that one encounters in trying to carry out a reflection on the socio-economic impact or interaction over a longer period of time. There's a sense in which that's over, and this doesn't really apply anymore. In some cases, you had to carry on a longer conversation to sort of try and build these linkages. Also, what we found actually is on the ground a very limited distinction between APMs and AVMs, right? And in fact, the questions were being asked was, you know, would this technology also be able to work for APMs? And that's really very interesting. In some contexts, a lot of conversations about the way that they're often laid together. And so trying to address one without the other, was seen as, sort of a limited response. But I thought that was very interesting that those distinctions, here in this room, we have a lot of those, but actually speaking to people in those spaces, was neither here nor there. I think also what we've come across, of course, looking over a longer period of time, the challenges that we are confronted with in trying to disaggregate the impact of clearance from other realities. Because, of course, over time, in many cases, the situation is better in general. So to link socioeconomic factors purely or simply to clearance can be very challenging. But I think for us, it works just fine because that is the reality, that it is an integrated reality, and this is why it's been important for us to take this sort of integrated approach that considers clearance, but also bears in mind that this goes on within a context with a huge range of other realities. Okay, and that is it from me. Thank you very much.
Questions? Welcome.
Thank you, Ekaette. It was really kind of inspiring to listen to you. Maybe one comment and then a question or two. On the comment, I think it's absolutely right, to link also mine action to socio-economic foundations as part of the palette, as you explained it. And I think now with the SDGs, and here is that can probably the link be made to the previous presentation. I think with the SDGs, I think there is already, at least at the policy level, the recognition that security, and if you consider mine action as part of security, as kind of a development outcome in itself. So I think that the link can actually be drawn perhaps more easily than maybe 10 years ago when also the palette was designed. And maybe on that as well, I think it was probably 2010, 11, 12 or so, but it was also kind of an important effort in the mine action sector to link mine clearance to development. At least at the GSHG, there was like a huge program, what we called the MAD in a way, going mad. So linking mine action and development. So there is perhaps also kind of to add a bit this nuance eventually. But to my question, you mentioned the reconciliation aspects, especially in Somaliland. Is that just for the context in a way, or are you also trying kind of to document that somehow? And if so, I would be interested in how would you measure, this contribution to reconciliation? And the second question maybe as well on the other factors that also intervene in the development process after mine clearance has happened, how you actually factor that in as well in your analysis of what comes out of a mine clearance project in the long term, especially. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, let me start with the latter point. I think because our approach is one of, we recognize this, and it is part of a web of activities, and we go on with it in that regard. I mean, I guess the ways in which we can do it is try and think of how these are interrelated with one another. How does clearance, for instance, drive, so you have clearance of the land, can it inform access to water, irrigation? So water and wells is, I mean, we are still unpacking the data from that as well, for instance. So all of these other factors, their way that clearance plays a role in generating that, but also just recognizing that clearance has achieved this, and that's it, and there are these other factors. But I guess in recognizing that that's what it is, also the limitations of what we're expecting out of clearance. Because when we think of the studies that went on very shortly after, we think of the impact assessment, there's a lot of focus on, well, this happened and none of these other things have happened. And so I think this work is also to problematize that approach somewhat, to say, well, the other things didn't happen, not because there was clearance or it's not worth it, but because clearance alone will not achieve those outcomes. If people that are producers don't have access to water, you clear the land, it's not going to achieve very much, in any case. God, I think the first point. Right, how are we documenting this? Yes, I mean, I think that has come out of earlier research, and it's part of a narrative on peace building and mine clearance. So we're going to do a separate outcome that's focusing really on this interaction. On the one hand, some of what you've mentioned in terms of how this is presented within the literature, but also how we need to also go into these particular contexts to see how that's been engaged. Because, for instance, thinking of Somaliland and Cambodia, the description of the interaction between economic reconstruction or development and mine clearance actually speaks to peace building. It's not conceptualized as such, but actually it is peace building. So I guess our task is to recognize all these bits, but pull it together to say it's not being called peace building, but it's actually peace building, and in a sense, hopefully deepening conversations about how we conceptualize what peace building is, and where do the voices of those in those contexts feature in that conceptualization process. So that's the sort of journey we will be taking with this one.
Maybe if I can add just a little bit on the Somaliland specific context, is the fact that mine clearance was part of the reconciliation process in Somaliland. So it was included within the debate of the reconciliation process, and therefore it entered into the discourse of peace building from that angle. And what would be interesting is to see to what extent in other places, for example in Colombia, where mine clearance or mine action was included within the peace process or the peace agreements, how that discourse is carried through. Yes, another question?
Well, one's an observation. In '97, when I arrived in Cambodia for HALO, there was a big dispute going on about land being seized by Cambodian generals and being used for personal gain, shall we say. So one of the things HALO did was work with a Japanese NGO called AAR Japan to go out and visit every single site that had been cleared in the previous 5 years and turn that into a report to go to donors. And it showed something like 85% of HALO's land was used constructively. But it's interesting that 22 years later, this issue is still there. But I think you're also, you know, your final slide is highlighting something I think that in Mine Action, tying slightly to something I said earlier, but ties into where I think Mine Action is incredibly strong is from when a task dossier is created and issued, whether it's created by an NGO, it's a clearance organisation itself, or whether it's created by the UN or a national authority. From the task dossier being given to the entity doing clearance to the issuing of the clearance certificate, the sector is very, very good. It's got good quality management, good quality control, it understands what it's doing. Where it gets a lot weaker is as soon as that task dossier is completed, the assessment of what is happening to that land, the impact on where it goes, is very poor. But I think that factors back to the beginning of the cycle when the programme is being designed or developed. Is, are people looking at the drivers behind the programme, the mandates, what's important, and then coming to the task selection, what is the impact of explosive hazards on these factors, and then turning that into an appropriate tasking prioritised system, and then a tasking modality that addresses that. So that when the team arrives on the ground, well, perhaps the team leader doesn't understand it, but the organisation that's doing the clearance is understanding why it's clearing that ground, and it's not just to stop casualties. Not that that's a bad reason, but if it's not for that reason, there is an understanding within the organisation of what the benefit will be in 5, 10, 15 years' time. I mean, the first task I ever did was to clear a road that allowed refugees from Mozambican refugees to return from Malawi to Mozambique. We let 1 million refugees go down the road, great impact. 6 months later, the incidence of AIDS in northern Mozambique had increased by 40%. You know, so there was a hidden negative impact as well as the positive impact of getting them home. But those sort of things weren't necessarily thought about, and perhaps if there had been a thought of the consequences of that, there would have been an AIDS awareness programme in the communities that suddenly were going to be opened up to these refugees. So I think we're very good at the technical bit, but the end and the beginning we're still working on.
No, I think a very valid points. I don't agree with that at all. And I guess the question is then how to support these groups to achieve that, because actually knowing what could happen afterwards requires research. You know, you go in thinking, oh, we're just going to clear, and it's this shift between the humanitarian must do it now, but how is one able to think of the now, and think of the later as well? What systems, what can one put in place to encourage that? And maybe lessons learning, I know that's a very tired, overused term, but what you described in Mozambique, to what extent has that informed practice elsewhere? Reflection on that to, go forward, because it's difficult otherwise. But thank you.
I think because of time, we won't take another question, but feel free to come and chat to Ekaette now and we can respond to anything.
Thank you.
We invite the next